Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name's James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. Welcome to ThinkIn. We are really delighted this evening that the historians David Olusoga and Melanie Backe-Hansen are here with us. You'll know them because they're a rarity. Historians who actually make it in the big time, make it onto TV and tell stories that are all of our history told in one of the most intimate ways I know in terms of telling through the history of our houses. David, too, you will know as the author of Black and British, a piece of history that not only made us rethink the way in which we thought about our country and all of us who live in it, but also about the history that we had in one way or another obscured and ignored, and how we need to rethink history. And I should say this, David and Melanie, we don't know each other. This doesn't happen to me often, that I start a ThinkIn, which, if you like, is intended to be an open news meeting, and I really don't know where to start. There's just so much here that I think about in both the book that you've written together, your TV series, and of course, David in Black and British, that you just think, it's so profound, it's so personal and touching, and also it's so deeply political right now. And so I don't know how we're going to get around all of it, but you'll discover that a ThinkIn is a sort of an exercise in organized listening, even if it doesn't always feel that organized. So the idea is that anyone can weigh in. It's like you've walked into our newsroom, but all of our members are members of the newsroom. So we have one rule, which is no questions. We want people to put to you what they think, their point of view, their personal experience. And given that so much of what you do in history is drawn from people's personal experience, I hope that will be a useful endeavor. For us, these ThinkIns are intended to be not just an event in themselves, but drive our journalism. And we've got one big project that we're working on, which is called The Future of History. We commissioned Sir Richard Lambert to write a piece about the future of antiquity. Richard Lambert's the chair of the British Museum, and think about the future of antiquity. But of course, we're actually thinking about it in a whole range of contexts. So I hope that in the course of this evening, people weigh in on that subject, on houses through time, their houses, the houses that you've looked at. As you'll see, my colleague James Wilson is kindly trying to corral the chat. Good luck to him, because I'm sure it'll come in every different direction, James. It's very nice to see you. And if anyone wants to make a point, I hope they know they just hit the participants tab, raise their hand, and I'll bring them in. Dave, can I start with a very specific thing, which is the statue of Edward Colston. And one of the things that's intrigued me, or actually was flagged up by my colleague, Kerry Thomas, who's one of the editors here, was not so much that in the moment the statue was torn down, but that for so long in Bristol, it remained standing. And what was the politics? What were the reasons for retaining it?
I think the reason was the same reason that we were sort of drawn to make a house through time in Bristol, is that Bristol is a city with a global history. It's a port city, but it's, I think, been a city that's struggled to come to terms with all of the chapters of that history. And we wanted to choose a house from the 18th century that would reveal Bristol's heyday, if you like. But that heyday is the decades in the middle of the 18th century when Bristol is Britain's prime slave trading port. So Bristol has the same challenge that Glasgow and Liverpool and London has, which is to confront the difficult parts of the history as well as the bits we want to celebrate. And Colston had stood there uncontested in the minds of many people, although there were campaigns to have that statue removed for decades, because his role in the Atlantic slave trade was forgotten, pretty much like the city's role in the Atlantic slave trade. The odd thing about Colston is his slave trading took place in London. He was governor of the Royal Africa, or deputy governor of the Royal Africa Company, which was a monopoly which was based in London. Bristol's slave trading decades come afterwards because the Royal African Company loses its monopoly. So although he's a slave trader, his slave trading's got very little to do with Bristol, which I think added to the ability of the city to brush his history, where the money came from, under the carpet.
And David, if I went to school in Bristol, and if I went to school now, how much of that is taught to you? I mean, when you say the words Royal Africa Company, you know, the beginning of your book, Black and British, you take us to Bunce Island, you take us to the work that's done by the Royal Africa Company, you know, running the slave trade out of Freetown. How much of that would I learn in any school in Bristol today?
I'm not sure. I'm not involved in education. I know a lot of teachers who do incredible work, who go beyond what the curriculum offers them, especially in parts of the city where there are lots of children of West Indian and African heritage. So I think it's varied, but I think that in some ways is part of the problem. It is all optional. It is all extra work. It is teachers going out of their way, because we've taken the imperial story and we've weeded it out of the mainstream history. We don't tell empire as a normal part of British history. When I was doing A-levels, there was a course on British history and a course on European history, and the empire was barely mentioned. Well, the big story about Britain, surely the big question about Britain, is how did this tiny island produce the world's biggest empire? And that enormous question is very much on the margins, a very sidelined question in education still.
And do you think, just to finish on the Edward Colston point, because when you say that he was, if you like, emblematic of something that the people of Bristol hold dear, a kind of vision of their city and the beautiful heart of their city, without thinking about the origins of the wealth that supplied it, do you think that there was something nostalgic about that? And I mean nostalgic in the sense that it's a sort of perspective on the past, not the past.
Well, in the case of Colston, in the case of Bristol, I mean, there was a very, very deliberate attempt to have his philanthropy remembered and the source of his money forgotten. The statue calls him a wise and virtuous son of the city. It makes no mention of where the money came from. The fact that the money was generated mainly in London helps that disappearing act. So the people who erected that statue in 1895, they were well aware of his impact on his role in the Atlantic slave trade. They just didn't care. And then this whole system of veneration and image control and reputation laundering was built around him that focused everyone's attention on his undoubted philanthropy and drew attention away from the Atlantic slave trade. And that began to become an unviable proposition in the 60s, 70s, 80s as Black British history and the history of empire and slavery became better known. I think what you saw in June was a generation of young people who know this history, who've read these books, who've bought Reni Adolodge's books, who've read Akala's books, who read Afua Hirsch, and they're aware of this history. And they know who Edward Colston was, and they don't buy the wise and virtuous son myth anymore.
But there's one bit of it, sorry, so I keep saying I'll move on from it, but actually the bits of it, the more you think about it, you're interested to understand. When a similar argument kind of ripped through the United States, particularly the South, around Confederate statues, Confederate generals. One of the things that I remember being completely shocked to realize were these statues weren't put up in the middle of the 19th century. They were put up in the middle of the 20th century around the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They were political in that sense. And what I've never entirely understood was what were the politics of 1895 and Edward Colston? What were they trying to assert in Bristol at that time?
Well, the merchant elite who ran Bristol, particularly a man named James Arrowsmith, was trying to create a hero figure for that elite, a figure who was steeped in philanthropy, who justified the domination of that merchant elite over Bristol historically. They stumbled across the Edward Colston because he was famous, because of his name was on a school, his name was on an almshouse. He's not the biggest philanthropist in the city's history, but he was somebody who was a member of those societies, a member of those organizations, who was one of them, and he was just selected to be the poster boy for the power and the supposed success and philanthropy of that merchant elite. This isn't an attempt to whitewash the history of a slave trader. They just didn't care that he was a slave trader because they didn't care very much about the Atlantic slave trade or its legacy.
David, thanks. I want to come to how we think about that history, how we think about, I suppose, the sort of central theme of your book, Black and British, which is, to me at least, how much we choose to forget or neglect in our history. But first, if I can, what I'd love to do is bring Melanie in so that we really can have a conversation. You'll see there's a lot of conversation in the chat, Melanie. And without getting into the particular houses through time, what I'm interested in is how you think the process, how you think approaching history through something more material and intimate will take us away from cabbages and kings, will make us think differently about how we construct our understanding of history.
Well, yeah, there's so much to it, but I'm a big believer in that, what's come to be known as sort of personal history. And I think the avenue of a house is the perfect portal for that. And actually, it's where we've lived our lives. It's where generations have lived their lives. It's where we're perhaps most at home, we're most ourselves. But it's everything connected to personal history. And it's that social history side of things. And it's so far removed from kings and queens and, you know, the generals of wars and all those sort of big subjects that we tend to focus on. But actually, it's the everyday history. It's how did people go to work? What was their work experience like? What was it like when they got home? What was their family situation like? How did they live in the house? And all those experiences. And it just brings in this whole other level of history, which we don't tend to look at so much, or we haven't in the past. And I think that's perhaps why it's been so popular. And it's the same reason perhaps family history has seen such interest, because it's personalizing and it's actually making history alive to sort of ordinary people, because actually it's far closer to them and how they've lived their lives and connected to perhaps how their ancestors lived and how they experienced life. So,
and do you think, Melanie, that part of this is also our inability? So I'm starting to feel like I'm on the set of a different movie altogether. Forgive me, next to this, what's going over. The part of this is also about international stories of history. I see, you know, I'd love to bring in Emma, who wrote this really sort of striking thing, which was that her son had learnt about Martin Luther King, but not the Bristol bus boycotts, that there's something strangely anti-local about the way in which we think about our history. And something that really struck me about, you know, looking at the houses was, actually, it wasn't just about history I was learning. I was actually learning about towns that I didn't know and places I didn't know. And so how you think about the intersection between geography and history, place and history.
It's sad that if you speak to a lot of local historians, they're kind of, I don't know, poo-pooed a little bit. It's seen as a not proper history. It's, I don't know, it's like, you know, you only do local history if you're retired. And, you know, it's got a certain kind of persona, which is unfortunate, and I wholly disagree with it, because there is so much wealth to what we call local history. And I think the challenges are there is just so much history. I mean, I actually went to school in Australia, but I studied every possible British history subject I could. But of course, it was limited, and there was limits to the subjects that I learned. And of course, I learned British history from an Australian perspective. So of course that had all sorts of other challenges with it. So the same with, if you're going to school in Bristol, if you're going to school in Edinburgh, if you're going to a school in Kent, you know, there are going to be nuances to the different ways you look at history and how it's taught. And it's a challenge, because I feel for sort of history teachers who've just got so much to take on. And it's a bit sad that a lot of times I speak to people, and as soon as I tell them I'm a historian, you either get this look of flashback to terrible history lessons and how it bored them to death of, you know, either learning lists of kings or whatever it was, or, you know, the battles of the Civil War, whatever it might have been. But it's unfortunate and it's really sad that people don't get that introduction to how fascinating so much more history can be. And yeah, it's that the local history, the house histories, family history, it's sort of seen as a lower level of history, but it's got so much more to it, and it opens the door, sort of, pardon the pun, to so much more. And whether it's the personal experiences of women on the home front in the First World War, whether it's the, I don't know, experiences of workers in the Industrial Revolution, there's the houses and family history can give you a window, can give you an avenue into those bigger histories. So there's so much to it.
I tell you, one of the things I have to say I loved about the book was that you tell us how. Right. I mean, simple things like, okay, go and find the maps. This is how you're going to be able to find it. And there's something about it which is sort of, you're given the keys to the kingdom in that sense. I'm going to bring in just Daniel Dipper, and I hope Emma might be there. Daniel, if you're there, just because I want to know about, I touched on this with David about the experience of learning history, but if I got it right in the chat, you said you'd studied empire.
Yeah, well, I've studied empire myself. I mean, I've done a lot more study myself for my choice than actually because of what we did at the school. So we did in year 8, we did a very small module on the triangular trade, but I'd kind of class it as the typical sort of course, which was, you know, ships go from Britain, they go to Africa, they pick up the slaves, they go to America, they sell some goods, sort of thing to take back to Britain. But there wasn't much more depth to it, really, whereas actually I was just saying I did a future learn course from Exeter University, which gave a quite sort of nice perspective, I'd say, in terms of actually starting to look at it a bit more closely. I've been watching some programs about it. I'm going to be attending some lectures next week on it as well. So, yeah, I mean, there is actually an empire course you can do at A-level, but our school chose not to do it and did warfare instead. And the British history paper we did do at A-level, because I'm a year 13 student now, I was saying no mention of the Bristol bus boycotts, even though we do an American paper which focuses a lot on the civil rights movement. And in terms of the empire, even though actually the 25% statistic for the British Empire was during the 1920s that it was actually the case, there's barely a mention of empire whatsoever. Literally, like, you can barely find it. The only thing is the Suez Crisis gets a little sort of footnote. That's it. That is the level of empire. It doesn't look at anything about decolonization or nothing. It's literally very sort of domestic centric.
It's interesting, Daniel, what you say about marginal, because when I was thinking about this today and I was going back to your book, David, I also went back to the BBC site, and I should say this was when I was at the BBC, and you'd done something that pitched Black and British around this idea of quote unquote alt history. And I wonder whether or not your view of that has changed, particularly in the light of the Black Lives Matter movement, that you're like, no, it's not alt history, it's history.
Well, I mean, the alt history was a label. It was attached to actually projects we did last year, which were designed for to be on YouTube. I mean, as I say in the book and the TV series, I mean, this isn't a marginal history, and that's one of the problems. The idea that Black history is a separate subject, or the empire is a separate subject, and it's only of interest to non-white people. And I think that's the problem. The reason that I'm passionate that we need to change, and I'm very sad to hear that things are pretty much as bad in schools as every report tells me. I'm sad to hear that your education has failed to include these rather like-minded. But the reason I think it's important is not just because the Black kids in the class need to hear the stories that explain how their family histories became entwined in British power and the British story and the British Empire, but their white classmates need to understand that just as much. When I was at school, I went to a school in the Northeast, a comprehensive school in Gateshead. I went to the same school as Paul Gascoigne. And there was me and my sisters, this Nigerian family, and no context at all to explain why on earth we were there, why you have Nigerian Geordies. And my classmates needed to understand that as much as I did. And the marginalization of it, the idea that it's a special subject, that is not helpful. And this is why Black History Month can only go so far. You need to rethread the weave of empire back into the mainstream British story. If I may, I mean, the classic example, I was taught the Industrial Revolution. School in the Northeast, the Industrial Revolution was the biggest story. But I was never told where the cotton in the mills of Lancashire came from. 4,500 mills, 1 in 5 people in Britain in the 1860s, in some way connected to the cotton economy. Every detail, spinning jennies, water frames, apart from the detail of where the cotton came from. Mm-hmm. That's an omission that is so dubious and questionable that you have to start wondering what the motivations behind that omission were.
There were 2 things I remember when I read Black and British, which I remember made me sort of really just lean into the book and think, good grief. One was, of course, your story, which I'd like to come to in a moment, but another was exactly this point, was this sense that I'd studied or thought I'd understood the origins of empire and felt all of this was completely, I was going to say unreported in the way in which we studied our history. And there was one line I remember thinking that sort of epitomized it, and I'm not sure I'm going to remember it exactly correctly, but funny enough, it touched on this thing that you mentioned, the Royal Africa Company. And I think you wrote, David, a line that said something like, and the royal was not honorific, i.e. that there was a material gain that went to the monarchy, the royal family, all its interests. And I just wonder how you think the UK now tackles this, because at the heart of this issue of empire are the institutions that are now venerated today without an accountability for the past.
Well, everything is complicit in the story of empire because it's the biggest story in British history. The royal family lent its name, and the Stuart kings were investors in the Royal African Company. There were Georgian kings who owned enslaved people. Right through until the 60s, 1880s, Britain is investing in slavery in America and in Brazil long after slavery in the British Empire has come to an end. And the imperial story is one in which the monarch is at the center of the warrant for empire, the idea that this is an empire ruled by a monarch in the name of subjects. The problem is, Orwell once described Britain as being like a rich family sitting around the dinner table with no one wanting to talk about where the money came from. We've created this idea that real British history took place in Britain, and that is the Ireland story. And everything else is ancillary, or it's marginal, or it's an optional extra to have on the curriculum. And that is the fundamental problem, that this history, what we think of as mainstream history, has written the empire and slavery and the stories that make sense of black and brown people and their presence in Britain out of the main narrative. And the problem is that the time is running out on the viability of that form of history. We are heading towards a country that will be 1/3 BAME mixed by the middle of this century. 1/3 of the population will have a history that doesn't make sense of who they are and where they came from. That's just an unsustainable history. It's unsustainable in terms of history's role of bringing us together. It's unsustainable for the delivery systems of history. If heritage organizations do not tell the story of 1/3 of the population, they are economically unviable. If history programs don't ever touch upon the stories of 1/3 of the population, they aren't going to get the viewing figures. Time has run out on this island story version of the British past.
And in addition to that, if I read what some of the things you've written right, there's also a framing for our politics and the way we think of ourselves that is just based on a very partial history of our country. And I suppose where I'm going with that is, I was really struck when I read your book thinking, we're almost exactly the same age. I'm a little older than you, David, but the story of racial violence in your childhood. I'm going to tell it, I don't want to paraphrase it, but the idea that that was rooted in a complete misunderstanding of the history of our country, the culture of our country. And so I just wonder how you think those two things intersect.
Well, I talk to black people and Asian people of my generation, and my experiences are normal. Most people I know from my background have experiences of racial violence, some far worse than my family's experiences. They speak to a moment in British history where the lack of history, I think, had material damage on everyone in the country, because the stories that explained why we were there were not told. There's a phrase that great critical thinker Stuart Hall said, we are here because you were there. If your history doesn't tell you that you were there, then my presence doesn't make any sense. I had a row, as I often do, with someone on Twitter who was saying I was Nigerian and had no right to be in Britain. And my argument is, if you don't want Nigerians in Britain, you need to go back to the 1850s and persuade Lord Palmerston not to invade the city of my birth in Nigeria. It's too late for that. And we have this weird myopia, schizophrenia almost. We like to remind ourselves and remind other people that Britain was the country that had, by one form of measurement, the biggest empire the world has ever seen. And yet we want to pretend that empire had no material consequences on the country that we are today. Those two things cannot be true at the same time.
I'm going to invite a few people in, because while you've been talking, Dave, there's just been a torrent of people making interesting points. I'd love to bring in Susan Corbacero if you're there, Susan, because I'm interested to hear the US experience. Hello, Susan.
Hello.
I have to say, I'm not sure what your background is there.
Well, my PhD is in Russian and European history, and I taught at a university, and now I'm teaching at an independent school. And one thing, I mean, I agree with so much that's being said, but one thing that's really heartbreaking is how little time we have to teach history in any kind of real informed way, in any kind of detail. It's always what's cut because it's not seen as vocational. And so it becomes even harder for the instructor to actually even get into this history. And it's really, really a paradox, all this call for history, but yet you're cutting the time when we can really do it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. No, by the way, I meant, Susan, your not your historical background, your academic background, the background on your Zoom call, which was
my that's Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Pittsburgh. Okay, all right. Well,
I don't have a beautiful home background, so I sort of went with that.
We went with Pittsburgh. No, that's great. I can see that Yelena has her hand up, and I'm going to come, if I can, also if Caroline McGuigan's there, because she's talking about the way she's looked at houses. Yelena, Yelena Sofrinovich, do you want to? Yeah, far away.
I just wanted to pick up on a point that David made earlier, and that he raises in the Black and British TV series about the textile industry. So the thing I found really fascinating watching that series was learning about the connections between Lancashire mills and the South during the Civil War. So in the 1860s, the northwest of England was really directly affected by what was going on with the Civil War, because it was dependent on this slave-produced cotton coming in from the southern states. So obviously when that cotton wasn't coming in, the mills stopped working specifically in Lancashire. And then in 1863 or 1862, I believe, the US actually sent over aid to Liverpool in boxes of bread and bacon and these bags and barrels of different foods that was destined basically for the people who were starving in Lancashire in recognition of their support. And I think that what we really need to focus on with our history curriculum is looking at issues including slavery and around empire, looking at them in terms of global interconnections rather than in terms of things that happened there or happened here. And I think that's part of our problem with the way that we teach history in the UK. And we talk about slavery or we talk about Black history, we talk about it as something that is separate rather than looking at the interconnections with it. And unfortunately, I think that disconnected global perspective informs and that permeates our understanding of issues today. So I've just been working on a podcast series about problems about sustainability in the textile industry, and so many of them are due to the fact that we're completely disconnected from the people and processes behind what makes our clothes. And ultimately I think that is informed by this historical disconnect that we have. And if we want to be more responsible consumers in the textile industry, for instance, then we need to recognize those connections and how they go back historically.
Yelena, thank you so much. David, I'm going to come back to you and Melanie too in a second, but I just want to take a couple of other views. Miranda Berry, I can see you've got your hand up. Hello.
Hey, hi. Yes, I've been following what's happened in terms of Bristol and the statue with a lot of interest, because history is taught to us in so many different ways, and we automatically assume that history is something that we learn at school and we learn at university. However, it actually surrounds us on a day-to-day basis, and the power of history over us can be quite insidious. And I think that's why this statue was so important, and it's something that every town, every city around the country will have imagery like this. You know, what things are chosen to go in town halls, what things are chosen to go on art gallery walls. And I think that's what I admire so much about what David has been doing over Twitter recently, which is more or less saying, you know, look, it surrounds us and it has power.
Miranda, thank you. I want to come to, if I can, we can bring in Caroline McGuigan. I don't know whether, Caroline, you're there or your video's on, just because you said you've been looking at your houses. If we haven't got you, I'm just gonna go back to Melanie if I can. Because Melanie, I wonder whether or not there's a touch of the wishful thinking here, right? Which is that in this more, if you like, human history, the kind of less traditional history, we do still make choices. I mean, I was really struck in A House Through Time, you know, the thing that's really, really interesting is the precision with which, particularly sort of, if you like, the three hero houses are chosen. They tell us something very specific. And so how do you get the balance right between, if you like, the participatory nature of kind of house history, you know, or cultural history that's open to everyone, and then the choice of those narratives that tell us about our values and culture? Because you and David must have thought a lot about that in making those choices.
Well, I have to say probably David is probably best to answer this, because he's far more involved with that final, how the story comes together. And I help the research team find the information and find the details. And then how that's actually put together for the television series and how it's edited is far more David's role.
Well, the reason I ask it though is one of the things, I was talking to one of my fellow editors this morning, Basha Cummings, and we were talking about a story we've been working on for months and months and months. And we now discover that it's not that story at all. Right. And I imagine that must have happened in Newcastle, in Bristol. It must have happened along the way that the story you think you were working on with the house was different from what you'd expected. I'm presuming in the research that was the case, wasn't it?
Yeah, again, there's a whole research team that spend hours, days, weeks researching the houses and pulling together the information. But yes, that often happens where you, either because you can't quite put the nail on the head and find the exact story that you want, or you can't find the evidence you want for a specific element, which is often a challenge with historic research. But also because you can start with someone's name, you can start with their title perhaps, or perhaps their role in the family, and think, oh, okay, oh, that looks interesting, let's delve into their story. But actually it might not end up being what you think it is, and it actually sort of, certainly for television, it probably perhaps had a really happy ending and wasn't dramatic enough to reach the final edit. But yeah, I think with any historic research, you can end up going down all sorts of different avenues, and you never know what you'll find in this, certainly through this history of houses. Yeah.
David, can I ask you a little bit about this? And I suppose I just wanted to pick up further on the point that you were making. I appreciate your point that our history is not really about us or who we're becoming. This idea that by the middle of the century, a third of the population will be Black, Asian, ethnic minority, will have a mix. And that the island story is, if you like, misrepresenting who we are to us. But there are also some material ways in which you could argue it misrepresents us. One is that part of the arguments around Brexit were around the idea of the UK as this enterprising trading nation, right, that could go out and, if you like, strike deals. When you look at the argument about Britain as an enterprising trading nation and the history that you see, how do you square those two things?
Well, I think Britain had an amazing period of dominance, and some of the reasons for British dominance from Waterloo until the end of the First World War, some of those have got to do with an incredible series of inventions and innovations and an outburst of energy and creativity in Britain. But some of them also have to do with the decline of the Ottoman Empire, the decline of the Mughal Empire that allowed the British a chance to take control in India, because they could not possibly have done so at the height of Mughal power, a decline in China's position in the world, an insularity in China that allowed European nations to get a foothold and then in the end dominate. So it's a false attribution fallacy to think that everything that happened that led to that century of dominance was something to do with us and not something to do with background conditions. Of course, that was an incredible period, and there was incredible inventions, innovations, and creativity in Britain. But it was also, there's a certain degree of luck. Britain was a latecomer to the age of empire. Our first imperialists were like Drake, and they were pirates, and they were just gnawing at the heel of the far bigger, more powerful empires, Ottoman, the Habsburg, Spanish Empire. Britain, in lots of ways, kind of got lucky, and France or Britain was going to dominate that period, and it was Britain, not France. So, I mean, even Enoch Powell recognized in the 1960s, he described the British Empire as this confluence of industrial power and naval might, and was quite willing to accept that it had come to an end. This imperial nostalgia that we have now, what's interesting about it is it's held by a generation in power now who have no memory of empire.
Yes.
The people who are talking about this golden age of the empire, they didn't experience it. For them, the last days of the Raj is not a childhood memory, it's their local curry house. They have no memories of it. So it's a weird, distorted memory by people too young to have that memory of an empire in an age that didn't exist, really.
I suppose, David, the thing, when I read some of your work, I have to say I feel really pained by it, right? And in a particular way, my family are German Jewish. We came over in 1936. We were Hershowitz. We changed our name to Harding. And when I went to school, I learned German. Strangely, or my grandfather who moved here promised never to speak another word of German in his life, but I learned German. And I went to go and study in Germany for a term. And I was really struck by how deeply they engaged in German schools with the history of the war. And when you look at, my wife studying at a college in the States, doing a course in the States, and you really sense on campus in the States, even digitally at the moment, the extent to which America is still dealing with the original sin of slavery in its history. Now, you may say it hasn't dealt with it in its institutions, in its economy, you'd be right, but it's in the argument. When I read what you write, David, I think to myself, good grief, not just in terms of our history, but in terms of our identity and who we are, we are tiptoeing around the hard truths here, and that must have an impact on how we operate as a society that goes beyond understanding our past. And given the amount of time you've spent thinking about this, I just wonder what you think the cost of that is.
I think it's actively dangerous to have a deluded sense of your history in multiple ways. If you think about that idea that you mentioned earlier about Britain as a great trading nation, if you look at one of the words that is used to describe Britain post its relationship with the EU is buccaneering. Well, the Buccaneers were pirates. Is that really the relationship we think we're going to have with the rest of the world in the 21st century? This idea that there is some innate thing about us that if we just tap into, the world will all fall into place. It's a form of dangerous solipsism. One of the problems with the imperial debate, such as we have it, which is very minimal, is it is about whether the empire was a force for good or a force for ill in the world. And this isn't a dialogue that we have with the former empire. This is a monologue we have among ourselves, as if we get to decide, we in this island get to decide whether the biggest empire in the world was good or bad, and that we come to that decision, and then we'll just tell the rest of the world, we all got together and we found out it was fine. It was all okay. Well, they have their own discussions. They have their own views. They have their own histories. The people that we celebrate in marble and stone, in statues that we barely notice in our city centres, they did terrible things to them and they haven't forgotten. And it's actively dangerous for us to have this solipsistic internal conversation about a history that affects billions of people around the world, whom we need to have relationships with, trading relationships, strategic relationships. And I fear we are becoming a country that has started to believe its own propaganda, its own myths. The fact that the citizenship test, as we were discussing this week and has been reported this week in the newspapers, create the citizenship and new citizens to Britain are bequeathed this fantasy one-sided version of Britain as a force for good in the world that never did anything bad, it shows how determined we are to perpetuate this simplistic, just anemic version of our past.
And do you think that in the, as you describe it, this monologue, the marking of our own homework in our history, that has an institutional impact too, in that we stick with our institutions because we believe that they've done a good job and we believe they're their emblems or the embodiments of a culture that overall has been for the good? And do you think that if we had a different history, we would have a different set of outcomes around our parliament, our monarchy, our systems of law?
Well, I mean, the comparison has got to be with Germany. I mean, Britain's had the great blessing and also the great tragedy of never having lost a war. Now, I'm not recommending losing wars. It's always a disastrous thing to go through. But the one positive of it is it discredits organizations. In the kind of orgy of blame that takes place in the aftermath of a war, no institution is sacred. And institutions, mindsets, attitudes, whole classes who have led to the disaster are called into question. There is nothing as reinvigorating as countries that have been through wars and will question everything about themselves. And we just haven't had that. Now, again, I'm not recommending that we go out and lose a war in order to have that, but I think we should recognize that sweep of the new broom that other countries in Europe experienced in the last century, Britain didn't have. And I think one of the reasons why we had the lack of economic dynamism after the war, I mean, if you compare the German economic miracle to Britain's stuttering economy in the 50s and 60s, you'd have to say that there is an incredible argument to be made for the reinvigoration and the lack of sacred holy cows in post-war Germany that Britain hasn't had. So in all sorts of ways, we're not good at questioning ourselves. We're not good at questioning whether we're good or bad at things. We're not good at saying, what is our role in the world? Because we've decided that we have an automatic free place at the top table, that is our destiny is to be powerful and influential. Well, the rest of the world just doesn't see it that way.
I want to come in a moment, David. Firstly, I would like to say it just rings so true because it also makes sense of the extent to which we indulge our institutions, our establishment, our ways of doing things, even when they seem outdated. I want to come in a moment to how you would reconstruct, if you like, the future of history, how you would actually approach it as a historian and also as a student. But we've got now like 1 million people who've got their hands up and things to say. So I'm going to bring in a tot of those if I might. Nina B, you've had your hand up for a while. I want to bring in Sally Young and I'll come to welcome in. Hello, Nina. Oh, I can't hear you.
Sorry,
Got you.
I think what the wider picture shows that when history has been recorded in a very narrow sense on a macro level, which is why going to the other end and being people who investigate what happened to ordinary people from the ordinary people's perspective adds a completely different dimension to history that we really, really need now. And thinking about what I've seen in A House Through Time and again, the tantalising stories that you just can't get because nobody recorded them because someone was thought not to be worthy of recording, whether they were a woman or a servant or whatever kind of person that was. How do we now stop that happening in the future? What should we be recording now as ordinary people to keep and make sure that doesn't happen to us, that our voices are on record and we keep that somewhere and it's not just the bigger picture that's filtered and biased that's recorded? I'd love to know how to do that.
Nina, it's a brilliant question. Funny, we were having that discussion at home recently about whether or not Alexa was listening to us argue about who had to do the washing up and whether or not that had any value over time. I'm going to log that. I'm going to log all of these things just so we can get a bunch of different points and that David and Mel can respond to them.
Of course.
Sally Young, your point was touching on the unheard, particularly about women in history. So Sally, do you want to weigh in?
Yes, thank you, James. It's occurred to me, there's a lot of analogy here between what happened with feminism and the whole sort of lifting up about women's history. I was taught history badly in Newcastle, not very far away from where David was taught history badly as well. And if we're talking about culture and identity, and if we ignore the culture and the history of women, black people, working class people, and all we focus on is the history of a tiny number of white upper class men, how will that define the future as well? So I think there's some analogies certainly with what's happened with women's history and indeed working class history. But I do think it's actually quite important. And in Newcastle, as David probably knows, there's only 3 statues of women and 2 of those of Queen Victoria.
My goodness. Sally, thank you. I'm going to bring, if I might, I think Mark Hayward, you've got your hand up, Mark, and I'm going to then round back with Mel and David in a second. Mark, hello.
Hi, yes, I'm just trying to unmute myself.
Hello.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I agree so much with everything that David just said a few minutes ago about the theme of self-delusion and so on. We've got a very interesting thing going on here in Shrewsbury. We've got a great big statue of Clive of India in the town square. And I think local people probably forgive me for saying that in market towns like Shrewsbury, people don't rush into making big rash changes. But when a big swell of opinion up recently saying that this statue ought to be reviewed, and lo and behold, some of the local councillors now are organising what's tantamount to a referendum on whether to keep the statue. And this looks like there's going to be some kind of a vote on this quite soon. And it'll be very interesting to see how it goes. We've lived in Shrewsbury for 25 years here now, and I myself have walked past it many, many times until recently, and just looked at it and thought, ah, yes, it's Clive of India, what a magnificent statue, and not thought that much about what it really means. A lot of people's perception of it has been really sharpened by the recent events in America and Colston statue, of course, in Bristol and so on. And it's always seemed to me, really, when I have thought about this, that he represents really strength from empire that came from really the country acting like a giant multinational corporation. Monopoly power by exporting goods to parts of the empire, and monopoly power over labour and other resources it used when it imported them or used them for production elsewhere. This may become more apparent to people when the local public debate gets going about Clive, and if that happens, it will mean, of course, what we're doing is we're rewriting history. And
Mark, just out of interest, I don't know Shrewsbury well enough to say, but your judgment, the two of you, do you reckon 25 years in that the town will vote in favour of keeping Clive or removing Clive?
I think it'll be divisive, actually.
It's hard to say. I wouldn't like to say. I don't think he should be removed. I'm not for removing statues. I think there's a place for them. You know, they shouldn't just, because people need to know, you know, the true story of who these people, largely men, who they were, really, and everything that they stood for. So I don't think they should be, you know, hidden away. I think maybe there shouldn't be statues of them, but people still need to know about what they did. You know, it's like the Cecil Rhodes statue in Oxford.
But you would have taken Cecil Rhodes down from Oriel College. You would just keep him in a place, or you would have kept him up there on the side of Oriel College?
No, he should be in a place, not as on a pedestal, but right. There should be in a museum, perhaps, you know, with an explanation of who this person was, you know, and the good and the bad, because some of them did some good as well.
Right, sort of museum less, more museum, less pedestal. Okay. Oh, well, by the way, thank you very much for the heads up on Shrewsbury. I promise you we'll follow that. That'd be really interesting. I think that we generally said we weren't very excited about more referendums, but in this case, it might be one to follow. David and Mel, I'm going to come back to you, if I might. Just, Mel, I just wonder whether you could pick up on a point from Nina, and also, I suppose, to an extent, the point that Sally was making, which is whether or not there's a different approach to history that tilts things away from telling it, you know, through, as you know, I would say cabbages and kings, but through these sort of the great men of history, whether you think the approach can help realise a different story.
Yeah, 100% I do. I wholeheartedly agree in terms of looking at the different layers of history, whether that's women, that's the working classes, that's different classes on all levels and all their different experiences. It wasn't just, you know, the kings and queens, but there's so much depth to knowing. I get more history in context. You know, that goes to the statue debate as well. You know, actually quite often people don't even notice the statue, and it's only now that people are stopping to go, oh, who is that? But it actually, if you're looking at all different kinds of history, all the context of experience of different people, and not only in Britain, but also not only in England, but the different nations, and then their relationship with other countries. And it's the context I think we miss, as David's been explaining. I think so much is just down such a narrow path. And I also feel, again, I said earlier that history teachers are so constrained by limitations, and half students don't even choose history as a subject to study anyway, so they don't even get the option to know half of this. But there is so much depth and so much value of looking at the history of all different people, different layers, and connecting their stories.
David, would you, I sort of gave you kind of the open sort of blank sheet of paper, if you like, and all of the different points that people are making ask for it to be sort of a plan to be drawn up that says, how do we approach our history differently? I'll give you a sense of what we're trying to do. We're going to take a week looking at the future of history. I kicked off saying the future of antiquity, and you can see in the work that Richard Lambert's done, thinking about soft power and the way in which we deal with antiquity, the tilt to tell classical ancient Greek and Roman history, but not other parts of the world. We started looking at things like big history, not the last 500 years, but tens of thousands of years, animal history, and then obviously the central question for the UK of empire. But if you were thinking about reorganizing the way in which we approach the research of history and the study of history, how would you do it?
I think I'd start by asking a philosophical question that I think we in this country really need to ask, which is, what is history for? Is it there to make us feel good about ourselves? Is it there as a form of recreation? Or is history, as I tend to see it, as a repository of cautionary tales, of stories that we are part of that have lessons and warnings? And if you believe that history is there as entertainment, it is there as comfort food to make you feel good, to make you feel that you are lucky enough to live in a country that is unique and exceptional and always on the right side of history, then you necessarily need to strip from that history the parts that don't allow for that outcome, the difficult parts, the parts when your country behaved in ways that you wish it hadn't, in ways that were reprehensible or murderous or even genocidal. And that's what I think we've done. We've made history a form of recreation rather than a form of reflection. To do that, we've had to strip out the bits that are uncomfortable. And the great problem with that is that the demographics of the country mean that that is unsustainable. So I think we are at a crossroads. And I think one of the reasons why people are debating history, the reason why statues are toppling, the reason why there seems to be a powerful generational divide in the study of history, is that we've reached the end of the road of a version of history where it is recreation. And there is a generation now who are quite comfortable in asking uncomfortable questions about their country and don't need to believe that their countries and their ancestors were always on the right side. And I've always struggled to understand why people had that need to believe that they are the inheritors of these race of angels. Why is it so challenging to believe that your country did bad things as well as good things?
What do you do, David, when people say, that sounds sane, in fact, even sage, but it's a slippery slope? Because when you say the repository of cautionary tales, what that means is that those cautionary tales are marshaled in the use of contemporary arguments. And very quickly, history gets politicized. And very quickly, you're choosing your cautionary tales to serve your current position. How do you make sure that those things, that line doesn't get blurred?
I think this by accepting that it will get blurred. History is always politicized. History is political. We are living in a country and with a prime minister who has modeled himself and his public image with enormous detail against his version of Winston Churchill. We're living through a crisis which people are comparing to the Blitz. We're comparing the death toll of this pandemic to the Blitz. We're talking about the spirit that people have to muster to get through this and comparing that to the, keep calm and carry on mentality of the Blitz. Throughout the Brexit debate, the imagery, the iconography, the language of the Second World War were constantly evoked by people on both sides, but particularly on the Leave side. History is political. It always will be. And that's why we need to debate it. And that's why we need a mixed history that has the good and the bad, because only when you have the full history with the difficult bits as well as the comforting bits, can that political battle be on both sides, as it were. The number of people who write to me very angry on social media or, try to get in touch with me to shout at me, because what they say is that my version of British history, the arguments, the stories that I want us to debate means I must hate Britain. That's, I think, is how lost we are. The idea that wanting to tell a holistic history of Britain can only be motivated by contempt and a hatred of the country. I think that's a sign of how deluded we have become about history. We would never say to a German who wants to confront German 20th century history that they must hate Germany. We believe that they're doing it out of the best interests of Germany, that it's healthy for Germany to confront its history. Why is it unhealthy when it's asking Britain to confront Britain's history?
But to make this happen, David, you are going to have to be challenging. I mean, I'm not saying you're not being challenging what you're saying. What I'm saying is you're going to have to challenge some accepted patterns. So, for example, you talk about Churchill and the Blitz, right? You know, I was in the car the other day listening to the radio, and it was another piece about Bletchley Park. And I just thought to myself, someone somewhere is going to do a count of Bletchley Park stories over all other history stories of the last 250 years, and Bletchley Park is going to be off the charts. And that leads you to a point that says, well, we're going to have to get ourselves more organized about which stories get told and the balance of those stories. And you know, I know that you've done a fair bit of programming now for the BBC, and I just wonder how you think about that, not just with the BBC, but with media generally, how you do try and get some kind of balance across our history, because some things are going to have to be less covered, less reported, and some things are going to have to be more.
Well, it seems to me that, I've been making TV programs for 20 years, is that we tell a very, very small number of stories over and over again. Yeah. And that there's so much room to tell a wider story because we've just regurgitated the same histories, and each new technology that comes along in filmmaking is an excuse to redo those stories. But I think this is already happening. I think that what happened in Bristol, last month was a critically important moment because it was directed and organized by young people. They specifically targeted not the built environment, not the entire memorial landscape of Bristol, but a single statue to somebody who represented a single history that they felt had been ignored and marginalized. And they toppled that statue. Beside it is the statue of Edmund Burke. Not far is a statue of Queen Victoria. They were untouched, rather like all of the shop fronts were untouched. This wasn't thuggery. This was a political protest about our blindness to our history. Now, if you have a generation that's willing to do that, then I feel that the appeals that people like myself make for a more holistic, a warts and all, an honest take of our history is going to find already an audience, an intergenerational audience, a younger generation, I should say, who are willing to confront these histories. I don't think they need young people. They don't need to believe that they are the only people in the entire world who happen to live in the one country that's never done anything wrong. They don't have that desire for a deluded and a exceptional version of their past. And I think it's true of young Americans when I talk to them.
Well, Mel and David, I see that we're running out of time. There's so many hands up, so many questions, and we've come to the end of the hour. Most of the time, we get to the end of the hour and everyone says, phew, I wish we could, now go and have a drink or go and get something to eat. I can tell, people wish we could keep going. But I just wanted to end by then asking you to conclude on this sort of note. When I hear what you say there, given what Daniel said right at the start about what he wasn't learning at school, given what you said about having had a similar education where none of this was touched, I was really struck by Daniel's point about having had a tiny triangulation study, but, a big module on warfare. I'm really struck by the idea that Edmund Burke's not toppled, Queen Victoria's not toppled, the education curriculum may not be working, but there's a sophistication in the understanding of our past that is beginning to seep through. And I just wondered whether or not your feeling is that things really are changing, perhaps more profoundly and more quickly than we appreciate.
I think this is an intergenerational moment. If you try to understand what's happened in 2020 and why it's happened, that is that is the new phenomenon. And it's so striking how deliberate, how purposeful, and how targeted the actions of the demonstrators and Black Lives Matter demonstrators across the world has been. This is, I don't think it's a change of political direction. I think it's a change of consciousness. And I think what history suggests to me is that when they take place, it's best to be on the right side of history. It's best to go with the flow and to be on the side of the people who want a new narrative.
David, David Olusoga, thank you so much. Melanie Backe-Hansen, thank you so much, both in terms of the how of history, but in your point, David, the why of history. I don't know exactly how you measure a good thinking. Sometimes they are the restructuring of your thinking. They make you think anew. This one has done that, but also given you a kind of host of phrases, which I'm going to, you know, gleefully rip off and pretend they're my own, and I'll try and credit you where possible. But repository of cautionary tales, race of angels, a change of consciousness, that great Orwell quote, which I've never heard before, rich family around the dinner table not wanting to talk about where the money has come from. We're here because you were there. These things I think are going to be banging around my head and probably many others for a long time to come. Thank you everyone for joining us. I know that we can't give David a round of applause, but I hope we can give him a cheerful and grateful wave goodnight. Likewise, Melanie Backe-Hansen, and thank you for what you're doing. You're making history broader, deeper, more meaningful for all of us. So a big thank you to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.